Hello, welcome to Unit 5 of our course. Unit 5 begins on Sunday, July 13th and ends on Saturday, July 19th at 11:59 p.m. I look forward to working with you during this unit. In this unit, we will be exploring the rise of conservatism and the election of President Ronald Reagan. We will explore what conservatism means and the policies that conservative politicians supported. We will also examine aspects of the women's rights movement. We will look at the campaign for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment and the opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. We will also explore the end of the Cold War. The Cold War came to a conclusion essentially in the late 1980s, early 1990s. We will examine how this came about and what role the United States government played in the conclusion of the Cold War. In this unit, you will be asked to participate in a variety of assignments. You will be asked to participate in 2 discussion boards. You will be asked to complete a primary source assignment and a film review. I'd like to go over a bit of the context for this unit and to discuss the assignments briefly as well. There emerged a conservative movement in reaction against the countercultural rebellion of the late 1960s and early 1970s. You'll recall from last unit that there was a great cultural rebellion that took place in the late 60s and early 70s, popularly known as the hippie movement. Not surprisingly, this sparked a reaction against the counterculture. And this was the conservative movement. The conservative movement emerged in response to a perceived attack on traditional American norms and values. Conservatives want to preserve a vision of the existing society. Conservatives argue that we should return to traditional values and traditional norms and resist movements for radical change. Conservatism in part was a response against the sort of counterculture of the 60s, the hippie rebellion. And in a sense, the hippie rebellion created a great rift in American society and a great rift in American politics, which has been present ever since. The countercultural revolution of the 60s, one's response to it greatly reflects one's politics. Liberals tend to support the values that were embraced by the counterculture, whereas conservatives reject the values of the counterculture, reject the hippie movement in general. And this rift is very much with us up to the present day. So the conservative movement emerges in the 60s and picks up speed and really doesn't gain power on a national level until the early 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan. So what did conservatives embrace? The conservative movement had several pillars, if you will. One was a movement against taxation. Conservatives felt that taxes were too high and that taxes needed to be cut back. Many people don't realize how high tax rates had become in the 1950s and 1960s. In the 1950s and 1960s, and even in the 1970s, the highest bracket for federal income taxes was 70%, meaning that for every dollar one made over a certain threshold, the federal government would take 70% of that, would take 70 cents on the dollar. So tax rates were very, very high in the period from the 50s through the 70s. You had the 70% effective federal income tax rate, for example. Some calculated that when you factored in state and local taxes, the effective tax rate reached 90% for the highest income earners. There emerged beginning in the 60s a tax rebellion, a tax revolt. In California, a popular movement emerged to cap property taxes, and there emerged this widespread movement against taxation. Another pillar of the conservative movement was a movement against social welfare policies. In the 1960s, there had been a large expansion of the social welfare state. This was organized by President Lyndon Johnson. President Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty in the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson was determined to wipe out poverty in America. And there were a variety of programs created to further this end. Medicare and Medicaid were created as part of the war on poverty. Medicare provides essentially federally funded health insurance for individuals over age 65. Medicaid provides federally and state-funded health insurance for individuals who are living at or below the poverty line. Another program that was created was Head Start, a program to provide federally funded pre-K, education and childcare for low-income families. Another program that was created under Lyndon Johnson was the Food Stamp Program, which has undergone several revisions since it was first created. Conservatives believed that these social welfare programs are misguided. Conservatives argued that what they perceived as generous social welfare programs were eliminating the work ethic in America and promoting the dissolution of the family. Conservatives argued that the government was providing a disincentive for work, was encouraging people not to be engaged in the paid labor force. And conservatives argued that these social programs needed to be cut back. Conservatives generally wanted to reduce the size and scale of government. Conservatives argued that government had become too large and expansive. Clearly, government had grown. If you go back to, say, 1865, the government did very little, effectively. There was no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no unemployment insurance. The government did not really regulate industry to any significant extent. There was no Environmental Protection Agency. There was no Department of Education, did not exist. The government really wasn't involved in much in terms of business or American life. Conservatives argued that in this period from 1865 to really through the 1970s, that the government had grown too much, had become too expansive, and that the government needed to be scaled back, cut back. And conservatives argued that this was affiliated with the issue of taxes, that more and more taxes were needed to support a larger and larger government, and that ultimately this government had to be cut back and tax rates had to be cut. This presents a bit of the conservative economic views and social views to some extent. Conservatives also, though, promoted a sort of a moral agenda, if you will. Part of the conservative movement was the religious right. The evangelical Christian community was central to the conservative movement of the 1980s. You see this with the emergence of groups like the Moral Majority, which was founded by the Reverend Jerry Falwell. Really, starting in the 60s, evangelical Christians become politically mobilized. There had always been a large number of evangelical Christians in America. However, they had not been politically mobilized prior to the 60s. Why do evangelical Christians become politically engaged? They become politically engaged in response to and in reaction against the Cultural Revolution, which they perceive as a decay in American moral values. Evangelical Christians perceived that mainstream American culture was moving away from their values. There began to be, a growing acceptance of sexuality outside of marriage. And then starting in the 60s, you begin to see at least the beginning of a growing acceptance of homosexuality. In the 1960s, you begin to see, experimentation with drugs. Evangelical Christians perceived all of this as hostile to their own values, essentially. A number of Supreme Court rulings also mobilized evangelical Christians. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court ruled that organized prayer was prohibited in public schools. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court ruled that pornography is a form of free speech that is protected by the Constitution. in the 1960s and 1970s, you do see a shift in what you see on television and what you see at the movie theater. And, increasingly you see, profanity, violence, and sexuality in American media and American film, which you never saw in the 50s or early 60s. And evangelical Christians react against this, basically. And they politically mobilize to support candidates who are opposed to what they perceive as a decline in American moral values. So that's part of the conservative movement also. So there's an element of sort of evangelical Christian morality on the one hand, and there's also this economic strain of a movement for low taxes and a cutback in social welfare programs as well. Ronald Reagan emerged as the sort of champion of the conservative movement. He was elected by overwhelming majorities both in 1980 and 1984. On one occasion, he won every state but one in national election. And conservatives swept into power, both at the federal, state, and local levels. Ronald Reagan did institute many conservative policies. He massively cut taxes. The highest effective tax rate was cut during his presidency from 70% all the way down to 28% during Reagan's presidency. If you're wondering, it has risen since then up to 39%, the highest effective income tax rate. Reagan did cut back on social welfare spending. President Reagan cut back on spending for a variety of social welfare programs, closed many centers for those with disabilities. Homelessness increased in the 1980s, partly as a consequence of this. The Reagan administration did cut corporate taxes and was very friendly towards certainly business. And there were some aspects of conservatism that weren't fully realized during the Reagan presidency. Ronald Reagan did not balance the budget, which was something that conservatives had promoted. In fact, budget deficits increased during the Reagan administration. Reagan did not cut Social Security or Medicare spending. One of Reagan's largest constituencies were the elderly and Americans who were age 65 or older. And Reagan did not ultimately cut Social Security or Medicare spending, which is the main reason, along with military spending, that budget deficits increased. Reagan did pursue a very aggressive policy in the foreign war, in the Cold War, I should say. That was another aspect of conservatism. Conservatives felt that liberals had been too willing to work with the communists, had been too lax on communism. And conservatives wanted to take a very aggressive stance in the Cold War. Ronald Reagan believed that the Soviet Union was fundamentally weak, that the Soviet Union was economically weak, and that if pushed, the Soviet Union would ultimately collapse and disintegrate. Therefore, Ronald Reagan launched a very aggressive campaign of a military buildup, building up huge numbers of nuclear weapons, huge numbers of conventional weapons, and massively expanding the United States military. The military budget grew exponentially during Reagan's administration, all of which was designed to massively confront the Soviet Union. Reagan didn't want a war with the Soviet Union, but he wanted to place tremendous pressure on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had to launch its own military spending program to try to keep up with the United States. The Soviet Union, though, was economically incredibly weak. Decades of command economy policies had weakened the Soviet economy, and the Soviet economy was nearing collapse. The Soviets were also weakened by a very long and protracted war in Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan and put in place a pro-communist government in the country. They were immediately met by opposition from the Mujahideen, the Army of God, and Islamic fundamentalist forces. The United States government, both under the Carter administration and the Reagan administration, funneled weapons and aid to the Mujahideen and to Islamic fundamentalists fighting in Afghanistan, and the Soviets fought a very long and bloody war in Afghanistan that was ultimately unsuccessful. The Soviets were forced to evacuate Afghanistan ultimately. In 1989, there emerged pro-democracy movements across the Soviet Union, which certainly were supported by the United States. And you began to see pro-democracy movements breaking out in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and ultimately, in a very short period of time from 1989 to 1991, the Soviet Union itself disintegrated and collapsed and ceased to exist. Conservatives claimed that they were responsible for this, that it was the conservative movement and the pressure placed on the Soviets by President Reagan that brought about the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is somewhat controversial. Others argue that it was more an internal movement within Eastern Europe for democracy that brought about the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and that the United States government did not play as large a role. So that's something that we're going to discuss and debate. One discussion board post deals with the values of the conservative movement. A second discussion board post deals with the end of the Cold War and to what extent American policy was responsible for that. The film that you're watching is a biography of the life of Ronald Reagan, which I think is very well done. You'll write a film review and commentary on that. And then finally, the primary source assignments deal with the women's rights movement. The Equal Rights Amendment was revived in the 1970s. The Equal Rights Amendment was an amendment designed to grant full equal rights under the law to men and women. Primarily to grant full equal rights to women in American society. The conservative movement opposed this. So you'll read one document in support of the Equal Rights Movement, and you'll read another document by a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, who led the opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. I look forward to working with all of you during this week. Thank you.